Hello. So, we are discussing about pricing, services pricing in the services business. We discussed briefly the fundamental concepts in the last session. And as you would recall, I had requested you to think about the pricing strategy for the next 2 years for a service organization like Bhojohori Manna or O Calcutta or 6 Baliganj Place. They are all players in the Bengali cuisine, offering Bengali cuisine in modern ambience. And this sort of service, which is more like a niche service, a kind of a narrow offering or specific offering for a large variety of customers, needs to be quite sensitive with respect to pricing and competitive pressures from similar outlets as well as alternative outlets, alternative food and beverage outlets. Now, if you are not familiar with these organizations, or you prefer because you are located in a different city, you can choose any fine dining sort of restaurant and do your assignment with respect to their pricing strategy. So, if you are in Hyderabad, you can choose a famous biryani and kebab outlet. If you are in Mumbai, you can choose Chinese restaurant like mainland China, or any other variety. You could choose some of those famous Mangalorean and seafood restaurants and so on. So, you look at a particular type of food and beverage outlet which can be classified as a specialized service, and then think about their pricing strategy in competition with similar specialized outlets as well as in competition with alternative food and beverage outlets. I am choosing food and beverage because most of you will be using such service time to time, and so you will all be familiar. So, it will become more relevant if you apply your mind to it. Today, to enable a good analysis with respect to this assignment, I am going to provide some more inputs and thoughts on pricing. As I mentioned, we are now referring to chapter number 6 of the textbook, and obviously it will be a good help if you also read the chapter side by side besides listening to the lecture. So, service pricing. Now, before I get to the difficulties with respect to service pricing, I would like to remind you that whenever we think of price, we think of rupees, dollars, euros, pesos and so on. But long before the concept of money emerged, exchange of goods and services existed from prehistoric times. And initially, obviously, these exchanges happened on the basis of barter. So, if somebody wanted a haircut, then he will go to the specialized service provider, the barber, and in exchange of that service, he would possibly give that person a chicken or maybe some vegetables or so on. So, similar barter based exchange of goods and services existed always, and it in some way or the other in many areas, in many remote areas, or even in the today in the modern economy on the eBay and others, we have such exchanges, exchange based transactions happening, value exchange based. So, the key point therefore, you should note here that the barter system and later on the money based system always emerge or have emerged from the concept of value as perceived by the buyer, which means in services we have difficulty. For example, one is very interesting is this time factor. So, if your hair has grown long and it is high summer and you need a haircut, then your need with respect to that time and that situation is critical. So, you may be prepared to go to a higher priced salon if your regular barber is too busy and so on and so forth. So, which means this time, and I would say expand it also to the context, and I will explain this a little bit more towards the end of this session. So, the time factor and the contextual factors can change the perceived value of a particular service, and therefore, different sort of pricing alternatives can become available without compromising on customer satisfaction. And this concept we will utilize in more detail in the next session when we discuss about revenue management and yield management, two particular areas in services pricing which are quite intricate and quite interesting. Also, another thing that happens is that in services pricing, from the service provider side, sometimes there can be gross mistakes because certain activities might not have been costed properly. So, proper costing or activity based costing is very important in services as opposed to manufactured goods. Also, we have already discussed a lot about the variability of inputs and outputs due to the particular characteristics of the services, and this can also change the cost and benefit calculations. So, if we look at therefore this picture, it becomes clearer. This is the acquisition cost for the customer. So, this can be kind of the price at which the customer is buying, and this is the value as perceived by the customer. So, obviously, as you can see that if the value perceived is at a high level, then you can possibly push this point upwards, which means you can charge or you can gain a higher price level in the marketplace. But remember that this is a kind of a two-way sword or two-edged sword, because if there is a big gap between the value perceived by the customer versus the prevailing price level in the market, the acquisition cost level in the market, it attracts more and more competition. The competition goes up in this case. So, usually therefore, one has to create a balance and strike a middle ground and see the best that can be obtained, the best level of price, because your cost as a service provider will be somewhere here. So, you would like to maximize this gap, that means the price that you are getting versus your cost, and these differences of variable cost, fixed cost, and revenue and its importance with respect to the break even, volume, etc., we discussed earlier. Now, while you would like to therefore enhance this difference, that the price that you are getting versus your own internal costs, remember that this can be a futile game if you are not constantly pushing this upwards. That means the delight factors of the customer, the value perceived by the customer should be constantly pushed upwards, and your costs should be constantly pushed downwards, so that you have a good ground to play with in between. And as because of that, we get these three main approaches as shown here: cost based pricing, that means set prices relative to your costs, and we discussed just now that in services one has to be very careful to measure all the different costs, and so activity based costing is a very good way of looking at service pricing. And therefore, when you look at your costs, you should look at costs which are on the front stage, that means in the visible domain, and costs at the back end or backstage. These concepts we have discussed earlier. So, which means that if you want to understand all your costs in providing a service, it is good to draw the service blueprint and follow from the input to the final delivery of service to the consumer. And you can provide low price, high price, mid-range price, but without knowing your costs, many times you can make horrible mistakes. So, this is very important, particularly for a new service. You need to very clearly understand both your monetary costs and different types of non-monetary costs, because the customer also calculates either explicitly or somehow implicitly the monetary price paid by him, as well as the different costs he or she might incur in a non-monetary way. For example, wait or time is actually a kind of a non-monetary price the customer pays, or hassle, or the convenience factors. These are all different types of non-monetary price and cost factors which one will have to remember. And since the customer evaluates that explicitly and implicitly, you as a service provider must do this very explicitly. Then we have value based pricing, that is pricing with respect to the value perceived by the consumer for that particular service. And as you can immediately see, that while this is quite quantitative and quite deterministic, this cost aspect, this value thing is has both monetary and non-monetary aspects. And so, this is determining the value as perceived by the customer is science as well as art, that as we discussed earlier, because you have to understand customer psychology, customer's behavior, consumer requirement under different circumstances, in different situations, and for different segments. So, until and unless you very well understand your STP, that means your segmentation, targeting, and the value proposition for your targeted market, you will not be able to understand because depending on this, the value for one particular service may have different types of ranges. This is the kind of an whatever may be your pricing mechanism, this is always there in front of you, the competition. That means what the competition is offering, that is always squeezing the price level. So, in some way one can see that as if this is your main domain of service price setting, and you have one kind of pressure coming from your cost and another kind of pressure coming from your competition. And between the two is the arena where you actually try to determine. So, this arena is the difference between your cost, customer's cost, and the value to the customer is further understood in terms of this dual pressure that is there on pricing of services. Cost based pricing, as I said, should be done by very well worked out activity based management system. You have to link your resource expenses to the variety and complexity of goods and services produced, and but customers, this is that is why I put this in bold and in bigger letters, that customers care about value to themselves, not what the service production costs are to the firm, to your organization. So, this is the key, that the customer value to themselves. They care two hoots about what your costs are. So, you have to manage your costs constantly downwards, and you have to, these are your costs, and you have to constantly manage for enhancing the perceived value in the mind of the customer. That is why this is often thought of as the positioning of your service in the mind of the customer, is a often used sentence. Now, as I was explaining, the value, which is therefore the arena where we want to play, where we want to focus our attention, is the perceived benefits to customer. This is the gross value minus all perceived outlays in terms of money, time, mental and physical effort, etc. So, again, as you can see here, that this is another way we are using the same diagram as we saw before. So, this is the diagram, that is the cost of acquisition in the mind of the customer versus the value perceived by the customer. This is what we mean by net value, and the customer surplus is the difference between the price paid and the amount the customer would have been willing to pay otherwise. This is something interesting. Again, we can go back to that same diagram, and you can see that if this is the acquisition cost of the customer, and the customer might have been, if this is the difference, this is the customer, what the customer would have paid otherwise, if the customer did not buy your service, would have paid this, then obviously you enjoy a very huge surplus. In reality, what happens is that even though the customer's perceived value, the customer may be delighted, in customer's mind he might have got, or she might have got, a very good deal, that means a lot of satisfaction for, in his or her opinion, a very reasonable price, then that gap should have been this, but in reality what the customer feels, that he might have been prepared to spend at this level, but he will not consider a good price here. I mean, in his mind the difference can actually go from this gap to actually a much smaller gap, and that whether the gap will be small or larger will depend on what are the contextual factors. So, that this difference between the price paid and the amount the customer would have been willing to pay in absence of other options, this usually is somewhere here, and in reality the customer may go up to this point. And so, as I said, this gap may not be achievable, but a smaller gap in terms of consumer surplus perception may be possible to achieve, and this is the game, or this is the strategy that we have to deploy. So, customer therefore often does not have a good idea about this level, that means or rather sorry of this level, that means what is the perceived value, really perceived value. So, customer often uses some kind of reference. For example, if the menu price is 100 in a restaurant, and we as IIT faculty get say 10% discount in a nearby restaurant, then we feel that we feel a higher level of satisfaction. So, the point is that we then compare our perception with respect to that reference value, which is the menu value. Sometimes when this sort of comparison is not available, the customer may look at the cover price of a magazine with respect to the subscription price and feel that he is paying a lower price. All these are different types of references. In the absence of this menu price or cover price of the magazine, customer may use something like a competitor pricing ultimately. So, let us summarize by looking at all the different types of cost explicitly and implicitly borne by the consumer. So, there is search cost, there is purchase and service. Search cost is that happens even before the consumer is approaching the service provider. This is actually when the customer has felt the need and customer has spent the time or references to find that which service he or she would like to use. So, this is also the time spent on Google or the time spent on Zomato or the time spent on Food Panda to search out your particular service outlet is the search cost. And then there is a purchase and service encounter cost. This is what we have been discussing, and here as you see there is money, there is time, physical effort, psychological burden, sensory burden. So, that means if you are in a restaurant where there is a the toilet is not very good and it is not clean, then this particular sensory burden can actually affect a lot, even though the money wise the customer may be paying less, and so on. And then there are of course post purchase cost with respect to follow up, problem solving, often we call this after sales service and so on. And within money there is a money paid for the purchase, there are incidental expenses and there are operating costs. So, if you think about any particular service that you have procured or any particular service that you might be offering, whether you are in a software service company or in an engineering service company or a consumer service company, you will be able to see all these elements at play between you or your organization as the service provider and the customer or the consumer. And lastly, this is the competition based pricing. So, as I said earlier that there is a constant pressure from the cost side and there is a constant pressure from the competition side, and in between is the arena where you are setting your pricing. So, if you look at page number 144 in the textbook, there is a figure number 6.6, and that shows that for say for example you want an X-ray taken, and there can be 3 alternatives to you: clinic A, clinic B and clinic C. And in clinic A, which is just located 1 hour away by car, but it may be very famous or it may be very good and highly recommended, but the next possible appointment is 3 weeks later and they operate only 9 to 5 p.m. and the estimated wait, because that clinic is very highly recommended, maybe 2 hours, and their price is 450. Normally, the services which are good services provided at the lower price, obviously they are in much higher demand and such a situation will emerge. Now, the next alternative, clinic B, might be offering 850 rupees and it is just located 15 minutes away from your office, and the next available appointment is 1 week later. They also operate from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., a little longer in the evening, so it is easier for an office goer. An estimated wait when you arrive there may be 30 to 45 minutes and they may be charging 850 rupees. And there is a clinic C which charges the highest, which is 1050, and it is just located quite close by, and the next available appointment is, you can have an appointment just the next day, and their hours are 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. and usually you do not have to wait more than 15 minutes there because they only operate on the basis of appointment. So, as you can see, at price of 1050, this is a more exclusive service or more a higher priced premium service where fewer people come, and therefore there is a better time and effort saving of waiting, or for appointment, or waiting when you arrive there, and it may be more conveniently located and so on. So there can be a combination. That means there can be a very exclusive X-ray or pathology shop, pathology organization, which may be even at a distance, but they save time. They only operate on the basis of appointment. Their prices are higher, but obviously in all these cases we will assume that the service level is, that X-ray level is, X-ray quality is good. So there is no problem with respect to the quality of service. So quality of service being the same, normally you would prefer, so there is price of 450, 850 and 1050. So if the service is same, or the quality of the final core product, which is your X-ray image, is the same, you would prefer 450. But there are other non-monetary costs like time, like distance travel, like the wait when you arrive, or wait before you get an appointment. For all these non-monetary costs, you might actually take the 1050 and still feel good, because that is in the context of your urgency, that is the solution which was the optimum solution. So as you can see here, besides this constant pressure between cost and competition, there is also a constant trade off between monetary costs and non-monetary costs. So there is a constant trade off between these two, which happens in customer's mind, consumer's mind, and the customer's value perception, that thing that is what the customer considers as his value derived or value delivered to him or her, versus the cost of acquisition of the service. Now here, this is one range of conflicting pressures which are at play, and this is another duality, this trade off between monetary and non-monetary cost, which is also at play. So price competition therefore can be influenced by high non-price related costs of using alternatives. Sometimes people may, particularly in more credence based services, which we will discuss again, like management consultancy or doctor's advice or legal advice, the personal relationships, trust, faith, all these also can highly influence the monetary pricing and the sense of value. So we will there look at also, besides these non-monetary costs and time and location specificity, we will see how different price zones can be fenced. We are going to focus in the next lecture on revenue management or yield management, an interesting area for pricing considerations in the services business. And there we have to understand that customers, in customers' mind, besides the monetary prices, besides the influence that can be there for personal relationships, from the example we discussed of that X-ray clinic, if we go beyond, there are certain kinds of services where the switching cost, inconvenience and time and location specificity can give us opportunities for different types of price setting. This yield management or revenue management, or RM as we will call it in short, is most effective in the following conditions: when there is a high fixed cost structure, when there is a relatively fixed capacity, service inventory, that means the service opportunity or the service occasion is perishable, which is there, which is true for most services, variable and uncertain demand, which is also true for many services, but in some services it is truer, and there is a varying customer price sensitivity. So when you are buying a soap, you are not prepared to pay higher price for that soap. in the evening because the shop is very crowded, or nor can you actually get a lower price in the middle of the afternoon when the shop is seldom visited by consumers. There can be some en bloc discounts given on a certain particular day at supermarkets and so on, but normally goods do not vary with respect to time, and therefore customers are sensitive. You can't charge the same customer one price in the morning and one price in the evening. But there are many other services where actually customer may not have that price sensitivity. So I would request you to think about such services, and if you are quick, then respond in the forum giving names of 2 or 3 services which in your mind fulfill these criteria, that is high fixed cost structure, relatively fixed capacity, perishable inventory, variable and uncertain demand, and varying customer price sensitivity. Then if you think about these, tomorrow when we discuss revenue management or RM, which uses various kinds of nice mathematical models, etc., but those models or discussions will become far more comprehensible if you can actually think in your mind today that what are the kinds of services which satisfy these 5 conditions. So that's your overnight assignment, and let's continue to discuss this topic tomorrow. Thank you.